Every night you'll be my untouched virgin, surrendering only to me. A beautiful, heartwarming and passionate love story, without millionaires, businesses or big buildings. I promise you'll watch until the end. Hi, my very beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's Stories. I love you all so much, my beautiful family. Every single day I pray for you, but today I ask you to pray for me. Everyone, please pray. And my beautiful family, I need you more than ever. Some people are trying to shut down this channel. I have faced threats, but I will not back down. This is our family, our home, and our journey. So it's your responsibility to stand strong with me. Like, comment, and share every video. Drop a comment saying, "I am with my brother, Mr. Peter." Let the world know that we are unbreakable. We will rise again. Now let's begin with love. The moonlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the Parisian hotel suite, casting silver shadows across their entwined bodies. Alexander Wolf's fingers traced the curve of Sienna Hart's spine with deliberate slowness, his touch reverent and hungry all at once. Her auburn hair spilled across the white sheets like liquid fire, each strand catching the gentle glow of the city lights that filtered through the balcony doors. "I've spent my entire life following rules," Alexander whispered, against her neck, his British accent thickening with emotion, his breath warm against her skin. Every decision, every choice, calculated for appearance, for legacy. His lips brushed the sensitive hollow behind her ear, causing her to shiver. "But loving you feels like the only truth I've ever known." Sienna turned to face him, taking in the perfect angles of his face, the aristocratic nose, the defined jaw now softened with vulnerability. Her fingers traced the sharp line of his jawline, committing each contour to memory as if she might wake tomorrow to find this all a dream. "Then don't stop," she breathed, pulling him closer until their lips met in a kiss that burned away everything but this moment, this feeling. This impossible connection that had rewritten everything they thought they knew about love. His ice blue eyes, usually so controlled and guarded, now blazed with unmasked desire as he moved above her. The weight of him was both shelter and surrender, a perfect contradiction like everything about their relationship. "You've ruined me, Sienna Hart," he groaned, his voice catching on her name. "For anyone else, for anything else. There's no going back to who I was before you." She arched beneath him, her body offering what words couldn't express, her hands mapping the muscled contours of his back. "Then let's be ruined together," she whispered against his mouth, feeling his shudder of response. "Let's build something new from the ashes of who we were supposed to be." The night wrapped around them like velvet as they lost themselves in each other, the distant sounds of Paris creating a symphony that matched the rhythm of their hearts. 1 year earlier, Sienna Hart's fingers hovered over the piano keys, the silence before the storm. The Royal Albert Hall's perfect acoustics would carry every note to the farthest corners, to ears that could make or break her career. After years of playing in dive bars and hotel lounges, this prestigious classical music festival in London represented everything she'd fought for: validation, recognition, the chance to prove that music didn't have to follow rigid traditions to move souls. But she wasn't playing someone else's composition tonight. She was playing hers. The weight of that choice settled on her shoulders as she took a deep breath, centering herself. The black and white keys before her, once so intimidating, now felt like home, the only place she'd ever truly belonged. The murmurs in the audience faded as she closed her eyes and began. The piece started softly, delicate notes falling like the first hesitant raindrops of a summer storm, her tribute to her childhood in Philadelphia, to the mother who had sacrificed everything to pay for piano lessons, working double shifts at the hospital and selling family heirlooms when times got tough. To the teachers who said her style was too raw, too emotional for classical circles, who tried to box her passion into neat measures and appropriate dynamics. The melody built, growing bolder, wilder, her rebellion against those who tried to contain her passion within rigid structures. Her fingers flew across the keys, no longer following the sheet music, but something deeper, something true. The notes cascaded and collided, creating harmonies that weren't found in textbooks but in the chambers of her heart. Her body swayed with the music, her eyes still closed, shut tight against the critical stares she knew were fixed upon her. In the third row, Alexander Wolff shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The heir to the Wolff banking dynasty hadn't wanted to attend tonight. These obligations, the endless charity events, the cultural appearances expected of someone in his position, were merely duties to fulfill, boxes to check off in the ledger of his perfectly calibrated life. But the woman on stage, she played like she was setting herself on fire. Her body swayed with the music, her face transformed by each crescendo, pain and joy and defiance etched in every line. Auburn hair escaped from its elegant twist as she moved, a visual rebellion that matched her sonic one. It was indecent almost, this naked emotion displayed so publicly. Alexander found himself leaning forward, transfixed by her abandon. His program crumpled in his tightening grip, forgotten. The proper ladies to his left exchanged disapproving glances, whispering behind gloved hands about theatrical displays and lack of restraint. But Alexander couldn't look away. Something in her playing reached past his tailored suit, past the polished veneer of education and privilege, touching a part of him he'd forgotten existed, a part that longed to feel so deeply, to express so freely. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of stunned silence before the audience erupted. Some rose immediately, others clapped with reluctant admiration, while a few remained seated in silent protest against such innovation. Alexander remained seated while others rose for a standing ovation, unable to move, unable to process the strange sensation in his chest, like something long dormant had suddenly awakened, like the first crack in ice that had frozen solid years ago. Backstage, Sienna accepted congratulations with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Critics praised her technical skill but called her original composition undisciplined and too modern for the venue. The festival organizer patted her shoulder condescendingly, his expression a mixture of pride at having discovered her and embarrassment at her boundary pushing. "Wonderful performance, dear. Perhaps next year stick to Chopin. Your interpretations of the classics are quite acceptable." Sienna's smile tightened. She'd heard variations of this her entire career. Praise always followed by correction. Always the implication that her true self wasn't quite what the world wanted, that to be accepted she needed to be less passionate, less original, less herself. She slipped away from the reception, finding refuge on a balcony overlooking London's glittering skyline. The cool night air soothed her flushed skin as she leaned against the stone balustrade, letting the adrenaline of performing ebb away. Below, the Thames reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds, beautiful but cold. "You played Chopin in the first half like you were reading a shopping list," came a crisp voice behind her. "But your own composition, that was something else entirely." Sienna turned to find a tall man in an impeccably tailored tuxedo watching her. His face could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and perfect symmetry. But it was his eyes that caught her, ice blue, and somehow both cold and burning at once. Eyes that saw too much. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" she asked, raising an eyebrow, surprised by her own boldness. Something about his aristocratic bearing made her instinctively want to challenge him. An observation. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of her spark. "I'm Alexander. I know who you are. Everyone in the music world knew the Wolfs, old money, old power, old traditions. They funded half the symphonies in Europe, wielding their cultural influence like a subtle scepter. His family name was on the program as a primary benefactor of the festival. And your Sienna Hart, the pianist who plays classical music like jazz and jazz like a classical revolution. He moved to stand beside her at the balustrade, not close enough to invade her space, but near enough that she caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and understated, with notes of cedar and bergamot. She laughed despite herself. "You make me sound like a musical anarchist, aren't you?" Those blue eyes studied her with unsettling intensity. "Your bio says you were at Juilliard, then left before graduating. Played in jazz clubs in New York, then classical concerts in Europe. You don't follow conventional paths." "You've done your research," she noted, wondering why someone like Alexander Wolf would bother learning about her background. "I like to understand what I'm investing in." "And am I an investment, Mr. Wolf?" She met his gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated by his status or his scrutiny. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, perhaps respect. "The foundation invests in talent. You have that in abundance, though not always. In the expected forms. And you've never strayed from the expected," she challenged, sensing something beneath his polished exterior. A kindred spirit, perhaps, though one who had chosen conformity over rebellion. Something flickered across his perfect features, so quickly she almost missed it. Pain, regret, longing. She couldn't quite name it, but it resonated within her like a perfectly struck chord. "No," he said softly. "Never." The weight of that simple admission hung between them. Sienna felt a strange pull toward this man, not just physical attraction, though that was undeniably present, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. Two people wearing different masks, but understanding the weight of carrying them. "Would you like a drink?" he asked suddenly, the formality in his tone softening slightly. "Not here. Somewhere real." Sienna knew she should decline. Tomorrow she had interviews, a masterclass to teach, career obligations that required clear-headedness. Alexander Wolf represented everything she'd resisted: privilege, tradition, constraint. The careful world of rules she'd spent her life breaking free from. "Yes," she heard herself say, the words surprising them both. "I would." Their eyes met again, and in that moment, the air between them seemed to vibrate with possibility, with the sense that something significant had been set in motion. Neither could have known that this simple decision, this single yes, whispered on a London balcony, would alter the course of their lives forever. It would lead them to Paris Hotel, rooms and hidden rooftops, to passionate embraces and painful separations, to battles against tradition and unexpected alliances, to a love that would demand everything from both of them, and in return offer the one thing neither had experienced before: freedom. Chapter 2. Beneath the surface. The pub Alexander took her to was nothing like Sienna expected. No crystal, chandeliers or velvet ropes, just worn wooden tables and the comforting hum of regular people enjoying their evening. Hidden in a cobblestone alley near Covent Garden, the Midnight Fiddle was a musician's haven, walls adorned with vintage instruments and faded concert posters. In his bespoke suit worth more than most people's monthly rent, Alexander should have looked out of place, but he moved through the space with surprising ease, nodding to the bartender who clearly knew him. "You come here often?" Sienna asked as they settled into a corner booth with their drinks, whiskey for him, neat with a single drop of water, gin and tonic for her with an extra lime. The warm glow of amber lights softened his aristocratic features, making him seem more approachable, more human. "When I need to remember what real life feels like." There was no self-pity in his voice, just simple truth. His fingers traced the worn edge of the table, a gesture oddly vulnerable from a man who embodied privilege. Sometimes I need to be somewhere people don't recognize the wolf name. Don't want anything from me except the price of a drink. A jazz quartet played in the corner, their improvised melodies weaving through the chatter. Sienna watched Alexander's fingers unconsciously tapping along to the rhythm, betraying musical knowledge he hadn't mentioned. "You play?" she asked, nodding toward his hand. A shadow passed across his face. "Once. Piano. Like you. Not anymore." "Why not?" A wolf pursues. "Excellence or nothing at all." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I was merely good, not excellent." The simple statement revealed volumes about his upbringing, the weight of expectations he carried. Sienna felt a surge of gratitude for her mother, who had celebrated every small achievement, who had told her that passion mattered more than perfection. Over drinks that turned into dinner, Sienna learned the outlines of Alexander's life. The legacy of the wolf name stretching back centuries, his education at Eton and Oxford, his current position managing the family's philanthropic foundation. He spoke with precision, each word carefully chosen, yet Sienna sensed depths beneath the polished surface. Occasionally, when describing a piece of music the foundation had commissioned or a young artist they'd supported, genuine passion crept into his voice, quickly contained, but unmistakably there. The foundation was originally focused on preserving classical traditions, he explained over shared apple crumble. But I've been pushing to expand our mission, to support innovation, fusion, new voices. Is that controversial? Sienna asked, already knowing the answer. My father believes we should protect what's established. I believe nothing stays alive without evolution. His eyes met hers across the table. That's what your music does. Honors tradition while transforming it, makes it breathe again. The insight surprised her, that he had understood so precisely what she was trying to accomplish with her compositions. Most critics missed it entirely, seeing only rebellion, not respect. You haven't asked me the question everyone asks, she said as they lingered over dessert, neither wanting the evening to end, which is why I left Juilliard when I was on track to become a serious classical pianist. She mimicked the tone critics always used when discussing her career choices. Alexander's eyes met hers, that unsettling blue somehow warmer now in the pub's gentle light. Because I already know the answer. You couldn't breathe there. The simple accuracy of his assessment left her momentarily speechless. This man she'd just met had articulated what she'd struggled to explain to mentors, to critics, even to her mother, who had sacrificed so much for her training. How could you possibly know that? I recognized something when you played tonight. His voice lowered, creating an intimate space within the noisy pub. The sound of someone breaking free, even if just for a moment. His fingers brushed against hers on the table, a touch so light it might have been accidental, if not for the intent in his eyes. I know that hunger for air when you're drowning in expectations. Sienna felt exposed, as if he'd glimpsed parts of herself she usually kept. Hidden. And you? Do you ever break free, Alexander Wolf? Only in the smallest ways, he gestured around the pub. This place. Occasionally riding my motorcycle when I'm supposed to be in board meetings, talking to American pianists who play like they're starting revolutions. Something electric passed between them. Sienna wasn't naive. She'd felt attraction before, had relationships that burned hot and fast with fellow musicians, with men who claimed to understand her art but ultimately wanted to contain it, direct it. But this was different. This felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unexplored, terrifying and irresistible in equal measure. When Alexander walked her back to her hotel, their hands brushed once, twice, then his fingers intertwined with hers. Such a simple touch, but it sent heat racing up her arm, settling somewhere deep in her chest. The foggy London night wrapped around them, cocooning them in a world that felt removed from reality, where a classical rebel and a banking heir could walk hand in hand without the weight of their separate worlds pressing down. At her door, Alexander stepped back, maintaining a proper distance that contradicted the intensity in his eyes. Always the gentleman, even as everything between them pulled towards something wilder. "I'm leaving for Paris tomorrow," he said, his voice lower, rougher than it had been all evening. "The foundation is hosting a gala for music education next month. We need a featured performer." Sienna understood the unspoken question. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Wolfe?" She kept her tone light, though her heart raced with possibilities. "I'm offering you a stage, Ms. Hart. What you do with it would be entirely up to you. No demands, no expectations, just opportunity, freedom, the rarest gift someone in his position could offer." After he left, Sienna leaned against her door, heart hammering against her ribs like she'd just performed a concerto. The sensible choice would be to decline. Getting involved with a patron, especially one like Alexander Wolfe, could undermine everything she'd worked for. She wanted to be recognized for her talent, not for who she knew or who might be warming her bed. The classical world was already skeptical of her. This would give them ammunition. But the thought of seeing him again made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with career advancement. The way he had listened to her, really listened. The way he had seen through her carefully constructed armor to the truth beneath. The way his touch, even just his hand in hers, had awakened something she'd buried beneath ambition and independence. What she couldn't know was that across London, Alexander sat in his penthouse overlooking the Thames, staring out at the city lights, equally shaken by their encounter. In his world of calculated moves and strategic relationships, Sienna Hart represented something dangerous, something real, something that could not be contained in the neat boxes where he had placed every other aspect of his life. For the first time in years, he hadn't thought about what his father would say, what the board would think, what society would expect. He had simply followed the pull of connection, of recognition, the sense that in her wild, passionate music he had heard an echo of his own carefully suppressed desires. Tomorrow they would return to their separate worlds. He to the foundations, Paris office with its centuries of tradition, she to her next performance where she would again push boundaries and challenge expectations. But something had been set in motion between them, something neither fully understood but both felt with. Unsettling clarity, a recognition, a possibility, a beginning. Chapter 3. Paris ignites. Paris in spring lived up to every cliché. The chestnut trees in bloom, the Seine reflecting centuries of romance, the air itself seeming to whisper possibilities. From her hotel balcony overlooking the Tuileries garden, Sienna watched the city awaken at dawn, its golden light spilling across limestone facades. She'd accepted Alexander's invitation to perform at the Wolfe Foundation Gala, telling herself it was a professional opportunity she'd be foolish to decline. The fact that her heart raced whenever she thought of seeing him again, that was just an inconvenient complication. She spent her first week preparing for the gala, trying to convince herself that her anticipation was professional, not personal. The foundation had arranged for her to practice in a private studio near the opera, a converted atelier with high ceilings and acoustics that made her Steinway sing. There, she worked on the piece she'd chosen for the gala, a composition that balanced innovation with accessibility, bold enough to represent her artistic voice, but harmonious enough to please the conservative patrons. She hadn't seen Alexander since London. Their communication had been limited to formal emails about the performance details, each message so proper that she began to wonder if she'd imagined the connection between them. Perhaps in Paris, he'd reverted to his role as foundation director, the night in London nothing more than a momentary lapse in his carefully constructed life. The night before the gala, unable to sleep, Sienna wandered down to the grand piano in her hotel's empty bar. The staff had closed up hours ago, leaving only the security guard who recognized her and nodded permission. In the dim light, she played softly, improvising around the piece she'd prepared for tomorrow. Her fingers found new patterns, new emotions, vulnerability, woven through the strength, longing beneath the confidence. "You changed the middle section," came Alexander's voice from the shadows. Sienna's fingers faltered on the keys, a discord hanging in the air. He stepped into the light, and her breath caught. He looked exhausted, but somehow more authentic than he had in London. His tie loosened, hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. The polish remained, but the mask had slipped. It was too contained, she explained, her heart racing as he sat beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the heat of him, smell the faint note of bergamot that clung to his skin. "Show me." His voice was low, intimate in the empty room, a request, not a command. Sienna played again, this time letting the music speak what she couldn't say aloud. Her confusion, her attraction, her fear of what might happen if they acknowledged. The current running between them. The notes flowed, hesitant at first, then building in confidence and emotion. A confession in melodies instead of words. When she finished, Alexander's hand covered hers on the keys. The contact sent electricity up her arm, pooling somewhere low in her belly. "That's what I heard in London," he murmured. "That honesty." "Alexander." She began, not sure what would follow his name. "In this room, right now, I'm just Alex," he interrupted, his voice rougher than she'd heard it before. "Not Alexander Wolf of the Wolf Foundation. Not the man who's supposed to make calculated decisions about everything, including who he's allowed to want." The raw admission hung between them. Sienna turned to face him fully, close enough to see the faint stubble on his jaw, to notice the tiny scar above his eyebrow she hadn't seen before. Humanity in the marble perfection. "And who is Alex allowed to want?" she whispered, bolder than she'd ever been, drawn forward by the vulnerability in his eyes. His answer was to close the distance between them. The first touch of his lips against hers was gentle questioning. And then it wasn't. Something broke loose in both of them, months of tension crystallizing into this moment. His hands tangled in her hair as hers gripped his shoulders, anchoring herself as the world tilted on its axis. He tasted of expensive whiskey and barely restrained hunger, and she met that hunger with her own, opening to him, inviting him deeper. When they finally pulled apart, breathing hard, she saw something like wonder in his eyes. The perfect aristocrat had been replaced by a man stunned by his own emotions. "I've imagined that since the moment I saw you play," he confessed, tracing her cheekbone with his thumb, as if memorizing her features. "But imagination is a poor substitute for reality." "And?" She tried to sound playful, but her voice trembled, betraying the significance of the moment. "Reality is far more dangerous." He rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the inches between them. "Sienna, The sound of the night cleaner entering the bar forced them apart. The moment shattered, reality rushing back in. Who they were, what obligations and expectations surrounded them. All the reasons this connection was complicated. "I should go," Alexander said, though everything in his expression contradicted his words. Duty and desire at war. Sienna nodded, unable to trust her voice. As he stepped away, he paused, his hand lingering on her shoulder. "After tomorrow's gala, there's a place I want to show you, if you want." The question in his eyes was about more than a location, and they both knew it. He was offering a door to something beyond their professional relationship, something neither could fully name yet. "I want," she answered simply, the two words carrying the weight of choices not yet made, but already set in motion. Neither slept that night, both haunted by the brief touch of lips, the promise of something more, and the growing understanding that whatever was building between them carried consequences neither had fully considered. In their separate rooms they paced, thought of calling each other, decided against it, replayed the kiss 100 times. Both recognized they stood at a precipice, that one step forward would mean no turning back. For Alexander, the precipice was steeper. His world had rigid expectations, invisible but unbreakable boundaries. The wolf name carried obligations that had been drilled into him since childhood. Choose wisely, consider consequences, maintain appearances. The foundation board members, his father, generations of ancestors, all would view Sienna as a complication at best, a liability at worst. Not because she lacked talent or intelligence, but because she represented unpredictability, passion over calculation. Everything he secretly craved, but had never allowed himself. For Sienna, the risks were different, but equally real. She had fought for years to be taken seriously as an artist in her own right, had rejected offers from those who wanted to shape her career in exchange for advancement. Alexander's world could either elevate her work or reduce her to a footnote in someone else's. Story, the American pianist who caught a wolf's eye. Her independence, her artistic integrity, both could be compromised by the very feelings that now kept her staring at the ceiling as dawn broke over Paris. Yet neither could deny the recognition they'd felt in each other, the sense that beneath their differences lay an essential understanding. In Sienna's wildness, Alexander glimpsed freedom. In Alexander's restraint, Sienna sensed not coldness, but a depth of feeling carefully controlled. The gala would force them to play their public roles, the foundation director and the featured artist, professional and proper. But afterward, in the place Alexander wanted to show her, they would have to decide which was more powerful, the walls they'd built around themselves or the force now pulling them together. Paris waited, indifferent to their private struggle, having witnessed countless lovers facing the same eternal question: is this worth the risk? Chapter 4. Behind Palace Walls. The Wolf Foundation Gala transformed the historic Palais Garnier into a glittering showcase of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors where Europe's elite mingled in designer finery. From behind the stage curtain, Sienna watched Alexander work the room, shaking hands, accepting congratulations on the foundation's work, every movement measured and controlled. In his perfectly tailored tuxedo, he embodied the role he was born to play, the cultured heir, the perfect steward of the Wolf legacy. This was his world, she realized, a world of power disguised as politeness, of alliances formed over champagne, of calculated gestures that meant more than the words accompanying them. A world where everyone wanted something: influence, recognition, the opportunity to be associated with the right names. A world where nothing was simply what it appeared to be, including perhaps whatever was happening between them. The thought chilled her, momentarily overshadowing the memory of his lips on hers the night before. Had that been calculation too? The foundation director ensuring his featured performer would give her best, the practiced charmer adding another. Conquest? As if sensing her thoughts, Alexander glanced toward the curtain where she stood, partially hidden. For a brief moment, his public mask slipped, revealing an intensity that made her breath catch. No, she decided. Whatever else might be complicated about Alexander Wolf, his desire for her was genuine. That at least couldn't be faked. When it was her turn to perform, Sienna felt his eyes on her from the moment she took the stage. The audience faded to a blur of faces, the opulent opera house shrinking to the space between them. She played the piece they'd discussed, but infused it with the memory of his lips on hers, the heat of his hands in her hair, the whispered confession in the darkened bar. Each note became part of their private conversation, audible to everyone, but truly understood only by him. By the final crescendo, the audience was spellbound. Even those who had come merely to be seen at the right social event were leaning forward, in their seats, caught in the emotional current she had created. When the last note faded, there was a heartbeat of silence, that perfect moment when art transcends entertainment. Before the storm of applause broke, the standing ovation was immediate. As Sienna took her bows, she caught Alexander's gaze across the crowded opera house. The mask of the perfect host had slipped again, revealing naked want that matched her own. In a room full of people skilled at disguising their true feelings, his unguarded expression felt like the most intimate of touches. The reception afterward was torture, an endless parade of compliments and small talk while they orbited each other, never quite meeting. She smiled and thanked patrons who praised her interesting interpretation, while clearly understanding nothing of what she had played. She accepted business cards from promoters and conductors, made polite conversation with donors whose annual clothing budgets exceeded her entire life's earnings, all while being acutely, painfully aware of Alexander's location in the room at every moment, like a compass needle, unfailingly finding north. When he was finally able to make his way to her, a woman had her hand possessively on his arm, slender, aristocratic, dripping in family diamonds that complemented her ice-blonde elegance. "Miss Hart, your performance was interesting," said the woman, her English accented with old money and ancient privilege. "So passionate, almost improper." The word carried both criticism and grudging fascination. "Catherine," Alexander said, a warning note in his voice. "Alexander, and darling, you must introduce us properly," the woman continued undeterred. "Lady Catherine Blackwood, this is Sienna Hart," Alexander said formally, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. "Catherine is a long-time supporter of the foundation, and my ex-fiancée," he added, something unreadable in his expression. Sienna maintained her composer's smile, though her mind raced. Ex-fiancée? This woman with her perfect bloodline and knowing eyes represented everything Sienna was not, everything that would be approved of in Alexander's world. Everything she had been taught to secure and maintain the Wolf dynasty. "Charmed," Catherine drawled, her eyes coolly assessing Sienna from head to toe. Alexander always did have an eye for unusual talent, though his enthusiasms typically proved temporary. The calculated barb struck its target, but years of facing down critics had taught Sienna to reveal nothing. "How fortunate for the music world that his foundation's support is more enduring," she replied smoothly. Before Catherine could respond, Alexander smoothly interrupted. "If you'll excuse us, I promised Miss Hart a tour of the historical sections of the opera house, parts not typically open to the public." He guided Sienna away with a light touch at the small of her back that sent electricity up her spine. His fingers pressed slightly, an apology in their pressure. "I'm sorry about that," he murmured as they slipped through a side door, leaving the reception behind. "Catherine and I were engaged briefly years ago, a relationship arranged more by our families than by genuine feeling." "You don't owe me explanations," Sienna said, though relief flooded through her at his words. The idea of him with Catherine, so perfectly suited on paper, had created a knot in her chest she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "Perhaps not, but I want no misunderstandings between us." Alexander led her down a corridor, then up a narrow staircase that clearly wasn't part of the regular tour. Their footsteps echoed against worn stone steps that had witnessed centuries of Parisian history. Catherine represents a world where appearances matter more than substance, where matches are made for advantage rather than connection. He glanced back at her, his expression softening. "I meant what I said last night. When I'm with you, I want to be just Alex, not the sum of expectations that come with my name." They emerged onto the roof of the opera house, Paris spread before. them like a carpet of lights. The Eiffel Tower sparkled in the distance, and above, stars competed with the city's glow. The spring air carried the scent of distant gardens and the ever-present essence of the city, bread and coffee and possibility. "How did you know about this place?" Sienna asked, breathless at the view and their sudden isolation after the crowded. "A gala. I spent a summer here as a teenager, interning at the Foundation's Paris office," Alexander explained, leading her to a section where they could sit, hidden from view but with the city displayed before them like a private showing. "I found all the secret places to escape, the hidden spots where even a wolf could be anonymous." His smile held a boyish quality she hadn't seen before, a glimpse of who he might have been without the weight of legacy. "I used to come up here and imagine a different life, one where my choices were my own." The vulnerability in his admission touched something deep in Sienna. Despite their different backgrounds, she recognized the loneliness in being defined by others' expectations, whether those of critics who wanted to confine her talent to acceptable boundaries, or those of a family dynasty that prescribed a narrow path. She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "And what would you choose if you were truly free?" Alexander turned to her, the city lights reflecting in his eyes as they caught and held hers. "This," he said simply, and pulled her into his arms. Their kiss on the rooftop was different from the night before. Not the breaking of a dam, but the deliberate crossing of a line. His hands framed her face with exquisite tenderness, as if she were something precious and fragile. But Sienna wanted more than tenderness. She pressed herself against him, deepening the kiss, letting him feel the hunger that had been building since London. He responded with matching intensity, one hand tangling in her hair while the other slid down to the small of her back, eliminating any space between them. Against her, she felt the evidence of his desire, his perfect control beginning to fray at the edges. "Alexander," she whispered against his mouth, the formal name a reminder of who he was, of all the reasons this was complicated. "Alex," he corrected, drawing back just enough to look into her eyes. "With you, always Alex." The distinction mattered. His insistence on separating his public persona from the man who now held her, like she was the answer to questions he'd been asking his entire life. They stayed on the roof for hours, talking, kissing, learning the contours of each other's lives. Sienna told him about growing up in Philadelphia with a single mother who worked 3 jobs to pay for her piano lessons, about the teachers who tried to mold her into a more traditional classical pianist, about the night she first improvised. During a recital and scandalized the conservatory, Alex shared the weight of being the last male wolf, the expectations laid on him since childhood, the private passions he'd set aside for duty. "Did you ever resent it?" she asked, nestled against him as they watched the lights of boats drifting along the Seine. "The path chosen for you?" His chest rose and fell beneath her cheek as he considered. "Not until recently," he admitted. "You can't resent what you've never questioned. The wolf legacy was simply air, something that surrounded me, that I breathed without thinking." His fingers traced lazy patterns on her arm. "But lately I've been wondering what else might exist beyond that atmosphere." As dawn broke over Paris, its gentle light transforming the city from mysterious darkness to revealing day, they faced the unspoken question between them. What now? "I have to go to London today," Alexander said reluctantly as they descended from their rooftop sanctuary. "Board meetings I can't miss. And I start a small European tour next week," Sienna replied, reality intruding on their bubble of connection. "Berlin, Vienna, Prague." He traced her lower lip with his thumb, his eyes memorizing her face in the early morning light. "But I don't want to leave this in Paris, whatever this is between us." "What is this, Alex?" she asked, finally voicing the question that... His answer was both simple and complicated. Something I've never felt before, something I'm not willing to walk away from. He pressed his forehead to hers. I don't have all the answers about how this works. Your world, my world. But I know I want to find them with you. As the city awakened below them, they made plans to meet in Vienna, where their schedules would overlap, both knowing they were charting a course into uncharted waters, both choosing to sail ahead anyway. The currents of their separate lives would pull them apart temporarily, but like the Seine inevitably flowing to the sea, they would find their way back together. For now, that certainty was enough. Chapter 5. Vienna Waltz. Vienna embraced them. With Baroque splendor, the city's imperial architecture, a testament to enduring beauty. The birthplace of Mozart and Beethoven provided the perfect backdrop for the evolution of Sienna and Alexander's relationship from private affair to public declaration. For 3 stolen days, they created their own sanctuary amidst the ancient city. Alexander sat transfixed in the Musikverein's gilded hall as Sienna performed, his face alight with pride rather than carefully schooled into aristocratic reserve. Sienna navigated a foundation dinner with surprising ease, her natural passion for music education bridging the gap between her Brooklyn upbringing and Alexander's world of old money and influence. Between obligations, they explored the city like any other couple in love, riding the Riesenrad Ferris wheel with childlike delight, wandering through palace gardens hand in hand, and spending one perfect afternoon in a centuries-old coffee house while spring rain tapped against leaded glass windows. When I studied at Juilliard, Sienna confessed over Sachertorte in a tiny cafe tucked behind the Stephansdom, Vienna existed in my imagination as this mythical place where musical geniuses found their voice. And now? Alexander asked, his gaze carrying warmth that transformed his aristocratic features into something more accessible, more human. Now it's perfect, she said simply, but not because of the music history. His smile, rare and genuine, faltered as his phone vibrated for the 3rd time in minutes. Normally disciplined about ignoring interruptions during their private moments, the persistence suggested urgency. I'm sorry, he said, finally checking the screen. The London office has been trying to reach me about something supposedly critical. His expression darkened as he scrolled through messages, then turned the phone to show her a grainy photograph of them kissing on a Vienna street corner, clearly captured with a telephoto lens. The tabloid headline blared, "Wolf Ayre's passionate affair with American pianist." Sienna's stomach clenched. Being recognized was nothing new in her career, but this felt predatory, invasive, threatening the fragile ecosystem of their relationship. I should have been more careful, she began, self-recrimination rising. No, Alexander interrupted firmly, reaching for her hand. I'm not ashamed of us. I won't pretend this isn't happening. His thumb stroked her wrist with tenderness that contradicted the tension in his shoulders. I only regret that we've lost the chance to define this relationship on our own terms. The day unfolded with mounting pressure as Alexander's phone rang. Repeatedly, his father, foundation board members, the PR team expressing concerns about appearances. By evening, strain showed in the tight line of his jaw, the careful way he chose words during hushed phone conversations away from her. In his hotel suite that night, Sienna watched his reflection in the window as he poured a whiskey. Vienna's, lights illuminating the conflict on his face. Does this change things? She asked, the question that had been building all day, finally finding voice. Alexander stared out at the cityscape, taking a deliberate sip of amber liquid. My family has expectations. The Foundation's reputation rests on tradition, predictability. And I'm unpredictable, Sienna concluded, keeping her voice level despite the pain his words inflicted. He turned quickly, regret flashing across his features. That's exactly why you terrify them. He set down his glass and crossed to her. You represent everything they can't control. Talent that won't be contained by convention, passion that refuses to be tempered by propriety. His hands framed, her face with unexpected intensity. You embody everything I've secretly envied my entire life. The freedom to be authentic rather than appropriate. The vulnerability in his admission struck deeper than any declaration of desire. This wasn't about physical attraction, but soul recognition. Are you ready for what that means? She asked quietly. The consequences of choosing someone like me? I don't care about consequences, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. For once in my life, I'm choosing what I want, not what's expected. And I want you, Sienna, not just physically, not just temporarily, but completely. That night, they crossed the final threshold between them. Their previous encounters had maintained a certain restraint, a last barrier of propriety. But now, with their relationship exposed to the world, that restraint dissolved. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as they undressed each other in the suite's dim light. Vienna spread below them like a jeweled tapestry. His touch carried reverence, mixed with hunger as he explored her body. The curve of her waist, the constellation of freckles across her shoulders, the sensitive hollow behind her knee. Sienna matched his intensity, discovering the lean strength beneath his tailored clothing, the unexpected vulnerability in his expressions of pleasure. Their bodies met with a passion built from weeks of connection and years of solitude. In the tangle of hotel sheets, Sienna discovered the man beneath the perfect exterior, passionate, vulnerable, fully present in ways she'd never experienced with anyone else. The careful control that characterized Alexander in public dissolved completely, in private, revealing depths of emotion that left both of them breathless. I never knew it could be like this, he whispered afterward, his voice carrying wonder and a hint of sorrow for all the years he'd spent holding himself apart from such connection. Like what? She asked, watching moonlight play across his features. His answer came after thoughtful silence. Like finding a home I never knew I was searching for. The words, so unexpected from this man of measured responses, made her rise to look at him properly. His face, in the dim light, was stripped of pretense, open in ways she'd never witnessed. I think I'm falling in love with you, he said, the admission, clearly costing him something, perhaps the last of his carefully constructed defenses. Sienna studied him. This man from a world so different from her own, who somehow felt like her perfect counterpoint. I think I already have, she confessed, the truth she'd been avoiding finally spoken aloud. Morning shattered their cocoon with a formal letter delivered to Alexander's suite, the heavy cream envelope bearing the embossed wolf crest. His presence was urgently required at the family estate in England. Immediately. Come with me, he said as they dressed, his expression carrying new determination. Meet my family. Let them see what I see. Sienna hesitated, torn between standing beside him and fear of what awaited. Are you sure that's the right move? We could give them time to adjust to the idea first. I'm done calculating the right move, Alexander replied, his gaze holding hers steadily. I'm done hiding portions of myself to maintain peace. I want you by my side, Sienna, not just in hotel rooms and concert halls, but everywhere, especially there. That afternoon they boarded a private jet to England, both aware they were flying toward a confrontation that would test their newfound connection. As the plane lifted into the clouds, Sienna watched Alexander's profile against the window, resolute, but carrying an undercurrent of vulnerability few ever witnessed. Whatever awaited them at the Wolf estate, they would face it together. The path of least resistance would have been to keep their relationship compartmentalized, existing only in private moments. But that wasn't who either of them was. Sienna with her lifelong refusal to diminish her light. Alexander with his newfound Courage to live truthfully. The challenge ahead would not be easy. Families like the Wolfs had preserved their position for centuries by maintaining clear boundaries, by protecting their legacy from outside influences. But as the plane carried them toward England, Sienna found strength in the knowledge that what had begun as attraction had deepened into something worth fighting for, something worth the risk of rejection, something worth the possibility of heartbreak, something real. Chapter 6. Storm clouds. Blackwood Manor loomed against the grey English sky, centuries of wealth and privilege embodied in stone and stained glass. The ancestral Wolf estate stood on 1,000 acres of manicured gardens and ancient forests, its Gothic towers and sweeping wings testifying to generations of power and influence. As the car crunched up the gravel drive, Sienna fought the urge to ask the driver to turn around. "It looks like something from a period drama," she murmured, taking in the imposing facade with its countless windows watching their approach like judgmental eyes. "It's just a house," Alexander said, squeezing her hand reassuringly, as if reading her thoughts. But the tension in his shoulders betrayed his own apprehension. "It's a fortress," she corrected, recognizing the intimidation inherent in its design. "One designed to keep people like me out." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Then we'll breach the walls together." The reception inside matched the intimidating exterior. They were met in the grand hall by a silver-haired butler who had clearly served the family for decades. His perfectly neutral expression nonetheless conveyed volumes as he took in Sienna's simple travelling clothes beside Alexander's bespoke suit. "His lordship awaits you in the study, Mr. Alexander," he announced with formal precision. "Thank you. Jenkins, please show Miss Hart to the blue guest room. We'll join my father shortly," Alexander replied, his voice slipping into the crisp, aristocratic tones Sienna hadn't heard since their first meeting. This was his territory, and his armor had automatically deployed. "No," Sienna said quietly but firmly, her hands still in his. "We face this together." Something flickered in Alexander's eyes, surprise, then pride, then determination. He nodded. "You're right. Please inform my father we'll join him momentarily, Jenkins." The butler's pause was nearly imperceptible before he bowed slightly. "Very good, sir." As they walked through the manor's vaulted corridors, past portraits of generations of Wolfs in military uniforms and formal attire, their footsteps echoed on marble floors. History pressed down on them with almost physical weight. "My father can be challenging," Alexander warned as they approached massive oak doors carved with the family crest. "But he values directness, even when he disagrees with it." "Should I curtsy?" Sienna asked, only half joking. Alexander's smile was grim. "Just be yourself. That's who I—" He stopped, swallowed. "That's who I fell in love with." Lord Richard Wolfe, Alexander's father, greeted them in the grand study, a room lined with leather-bound books that Sienna suspected had more to do with appearance than actual reading. Tall and imposing like his son, but with steel-grey hair and colder eyes, Lord Wolfe exuded authority honed through decades of being obeyed without question. "Alexander," he acknowledged with a nod, pointedly not extending his hand to Sienna. "I see you've brought your performer. Father, this is Sienna Hart," Alexander said evenly, "the woman I'm involved with." "Involved," Lord Wolfe repeated, the word dripping with disapproval. "Is that what we're calling this public spectacle?" "I would call it a relationship," Alexander replied, his voice steady despite the heightening color in his cheeks. "One I had hoped my family would respect, even if they don't immediately understand it." Lord Wolfe gestured to a newspaper on his desk, open to the photo of them in Vienna. "Respect requires discretion. The Foundation Board has concerns about your judgment." "My personal life is separate from my work with the Foundation," Alexander. He countered. "Nothing is separate when you bear the Wolfe name," his father replied sharply. "Every action reflects on centuries of tradition and responsibility." His gaze finally settled on Sienna, clinical and assessing. "I'm sure Ms. Hart is very talented in her field, but this association is ill-considered." "Ms. Hart is standing right here," Sienna interjected, refusing to be discussed as if absent, "and has built a career on her own merits without family connections or inherited privilege." Lord Wolf's eyebrows rose slightly at her boldness. "Indeed. How commendable. Lady Wolf is indisposed at present," he added, with a pointed change of subject. "She will join us for dinner at 8. Evening dress is customary." It was a dismissal and a test all at once. Sienna recognized the tactics: establish dominance, remind her of her outsider status, impose rules she might be unprepared for. She'd faced similar, if less aristocratic, power plays throughout her career from those who believed her background made her unworthy of classical music's hallowed halls. "I look forward to meeting her," Sienna replied with perfect politeness, refusing to be intimidated. Dinner that evening was an exercise in barely disguised hostility. Lady Wolf had indeed appeared, a slender woman with Alexander's ice-blue eyes, and an elegance that made even her simplest movements seem choreographed. She greeted Sienna with cool politeness that carefully avoided both warmth and outright rudeness, the aristocratic equivalent of handling something potentially contaminated. The dining room itself was a monument to Wolf history. Portraits staring down from panelled walls, silver candlesticks bearing the family crest, china that had probably served generations of titled guests. Sienna, in the one formal dress she'd packed for her concert tour, felt like an imposter at the medieval table that could have seated 20. Lord Wolf questioned her relentlessly throughout the meal, each query designed to highlight the gulf between her world and the Wolf legacy. "Where did you attend university, Ms. Hart?" he asked, though Alexander had already told him she'd left Juilliard before graduating. "I studied at Juilliard for 3 years, Sienna answered, meeting his gaze directly. "Then continued my education, more practically, through performance and private study." "How unconventional," Lady Wolf murmured into her wine-glass. "And your family?" Lord Wolf continued. "What's your father's position?" The question was calculated to expose what he clearly suspected: her ordinary background, her lack of social credentials. "I never knew my father," Sienna answered evenly, refusing to show shame for something beyond her control. "He left before I was born." "How unfortunate," Lord Wolf murmured, his tone suggesting moral judgment rather than sympathy. Alexander's knuckles whitened around his fork. "Father—" "It's all right, Alex," Sienna interrupted, placing a calming hand on his arm. "Your father is simply trying to understand who I am." She met Lord Wolf's gaze directly, refusing to be diminished by his implicit judgment. "I'm a woman who worked for everything she has, who built a career without connections or family influence, who plays music that moves people, not because of my name, but because of what I create." A heavy silence followed her words. Something flickered in Lord Wolf's eyes, not approval, but perhaps a reluctant recognition of her spirit, her refusal to be cowed by his authority. Lady Wolf broke the tension with a deliberate change of subject. "Alexander, the Havishams have inquired about your attendance at their summer ball. Catherine will be there, of course." The reference to his ex-fiancée was not subtle. Sienna kept her expression neutral, though her appetite had vanished. The remainder of the meal passed in similarly strained conversation, with the Wolfs speaking of people and events familiar only to their circle, effectively excluding her while maintaining perfect politeness. Later, Alexander found her in the music room, her fingers moving silently over the keys of a priceless Steinway, not playing but seeking comfort in the familiar shape of the instrument. "I'm sorry," he said, closing the door behind him. "He had no right to speak to you that way." He's protecting what he values, Sienna replied, continuing to trace the keys without pressing them. I understand that, even if I don't like his methods. You were magnificent. Alexander moved to stand beside the piano bench, his expression both proud and troubled. Standing your ground without losing your dignity. Most people crumble under my father's interrogations. I've faced worse critics, she said, with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes, though usually they only judge my music, not my worthiness. As a human being, Alexander knelt beside the piano bench, taking her hands. You showed more class than anyone who was born to it, but my father took me aside after dinner. The foundation board is concerned about the publicity. There are questions about my judgment, my commitment to the family legacy. The weight of centuries pressed down on them in that ornate room, generations of Wolfs who had married strategically, who had put duty before personal happiness. What do you want, Alex? Sienna asked softly. Not what they want. What do you want? His answer was immediate. You, us, a life where I can be the man I am with you, not the heir to a dynasty, even if it costs you everything? She gestured around them at the trappings of wealth and privilege that had shaped his existence. Alexander stood, pulling her up with him. You're worth everything. That night, they made love with desperate intensity in his childhood bedroom, an act of defiance against the portraits of ancestors that lined the hallways outside, against the expectations that had shaped his life. His hands memorized her body as if he feared it might be the last time, his kisses carrying promises his words couldn't fully express. In the grey light of dawn, Sienna made a decision that broke her heart, even as she convinced herself it was born of love. As Alexander slept, she slipped from the bed and began to pack her things. Her tour resumed in Prague the next day, a convenient truth that could serve a deeper purpose. Watching him sleep, his face younger and more vulnerable without, the mask of control he wore while awake, she felt a love so intense it physically hurt. This beautiful, complex man had risked everything to be with her, but she couldn't let him lose his world, his family, his heritage, his purpose, for what might ultimately be a passion that couldn't survive in either of their realities. When Alexander woke to find her dressed and ready to leave, confusion clouded his face. What are you doing? I need to get to Prague, she said, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. And you need time, Alex. Time to be sure about what you're risking. I don't need time. He reached for her, but she stepped back, knowing her resolve would crumble if he touched her. I do, she lied, hating herself for the hurt in his eyes. This is happening so fast. Your world is so different from mine. I need space to think. She saw the hurt in his eyes, but also the ingrained politeness that prevented him from arguing. Always the gentleman, even with his heart visibly breaking. I'll come to Prague when I've sorted things here, he promised. Sienna nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She kissed him goodbye with a finality he couldn't yet sense, memorizing the feeling of his lips, the scent of his skin. As the taxi carried her away from Blackwood Manor, tears finally came. She was setting him free, free to reclaim his place, to make peace with his family, to continue the legacy that meant so much to them. Free from having to choose between his world and her. It was the most painful, most loving thing she had ever done, but as the ancient estate disappeared in the rearview mirror, a small voice whispered that perhaps it was also the most cowardly, choosing to leave rather than stay and fight for what they had found together, choosing to decide for him rather than with him. By the time she reached the airport, she had convinced herself it was for the best. Some fires burned too hot to last, some worlds were never meant to merge. What she couldn't know was that back at Blackwood Manor, Alexander stood at his window watching her taxi disappear, a suspicion growing that her departure was more than a temporary separation. And with that suspicion came a determination that would eventually lead him across continents and through the barriers of pride and fear. To find the woman who had awakened parts of himself he could never again put to sleep. Chapter 7. Fractured harmony. Prague's beauty felt like cruel mockery to Sienna as she moved through her performances at the Rudolfinum with technical precision but emotional restraint. The city that had inspired Dvořák and Mozart now witnessed her own artistry crippled by a self-inflicted wound, her decision to leave Alexander. Critics noticed the change. Heart delivers flawless execution but lacks the emotional depth that previously defined her style, wrote Prague's leading music reviewer. One wonders what has dampened the fire that once made her performances so compelling. What indeed, Sienna thought bitterly, staring at the review in her hotel room. How could she explain that she had deliberately locked away her heart to survive each day? That feeling fully would mean surrendering to grief that threatened to consume her. Her phone buzzed again. Alexander's sixth message that day. Since leaving Blackwood Manor, she'd watched his communications evolve from confusion to concern to something approaching desperation. Warsaw Symphony says you arrived early for rehearsals, but left your hotel. What's happening? Are you all right? Please just tell me what my father said to you. Whatever it was, we can face it together. I've cancelled Milan. I'm coming to find you. This silence isn't like you, Sienna. Each message was harder to ignore than the last. Each night she drafted responses she never sent, her fingers hovering over the screen before setting it aside. The truth, that she loved him too much to let him sacrifice his heritage for her, seemed simultaneously noble and cowardly, even to herself. When Alexander's assistant called to confirm he was rearranging his entire schedule to track her through Eastern Europe, Sienna knew she couldn't allow his life to unravel further. That would defeat the purpose of her sacrifice. In a Warsaw hotel room, while rain streaked the windows like tears she refused to shed, she composed the most difficult message of her life. I've been thinking about us, about our worlds and what I witnessed at Blackwood. We need to be realistic. What happened between us was beautiful, but ultimately unsustainable. You have responsibilities I can't share, and I have a career that requires my complete focus. Let's remember what we had fondly, rather than forcing something that would eventually break under pressure. Every word felt like betrayal of the connection they'd found, the promises they'd whispered, the future they'd begun to imagine. She pressed send before courage failed her, then silenced her phone, unable to witness his reaction. When she finally checked it the next morning, his reply waited, a single line that cut through her carefully constructed fiction. I don't believe you. 3 words that recognized the lie, that saw through her pretense to the truth beneath, that she loved him beyond reason, beyond caution, beyond her own fiercely guarded independence. Instead of answering, she threw herself into her tour schedule, extending performances, adding masterclasses, accepting interviews, anything to fill the void his absence had created. The irony didn't escape her that running from Alexander had made her more like him, governed by schedules rather than impulses, calculating rather than spontaneous. 3 months passed, then 4. Summer faded into autumn, the vibrant colors of Central Park mocking the monochrome landscape of her heart. As she settled back into her Brooklyn apartment, her compositions changed, becoming more structured, less improvisational. Critics who had once called her work undisciplined now praised her newfound maturity and refined approach. She hated every word of praise for what she knew represented emotional withdrawal, not artistic growth. The tabloids reported Alexander escorting Catherine Blackwood to the Royal Opera House Gala. The photographs showed him impeccably dressed, expression unreadable, back in his proper place, back where he belonged. Sienna told herself this was vindication, proof she'd made the right choice. But the knowledge brought no comfort, only a deeper ache that even her music couldn't soothe. Her mother visited from Philadelphia, arriving with the intuitive understanding that had sustained Sienna throughout childhood. "You look successful," she observed, setting down her suitcase in Sienna's apartment, "and completely miserable." That night, over takeout and wine, everything spilled out. London, Paris, Vienna, the Wolf estate. The choice she'd made to walk away. "You've spent your whole life fighting people who tried to tell you what you couldn't handle," her mother said when she finished. "Why give Alexander's family that power now?" "I didn't want him to lose everything, so you decided for him." Her mother's gentle observation landed like a judgment, without asking what he was willing to risk. Put that way, her sacrifice seemed not selfless but presumptuous, exactly what she had always resented in others who tried to dictate her path. "What if he's moved on?" Sienna whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Her mother squeezed her hand. "Then you'll know. But what if he hasn't?" On a rain-soaked Tuesday in October, precisely 17 weeks after she'd left Blackwood Manor, Sienna was practicing a new composition when knocking shattered her concentration. Expecting the grocery delivery she'd ordered, she opened the door without checking and found Alexander Wolf standing in her hallway, soaking wet, his eyes burning with intensity that stole her breath. "You lied," he said without preamble. Every word in that message was a lie. Sienna gripped the doorframe, her knees suddenly weak. He looked different, thinner, the perfect tailoring of his coat unable to conceal weight loss, dark shadows beneath eyes that held both exhaustion and determination. "How did you find me?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Did you think I wouldn't?" His voice carried rawness she'd never heard from him, stripped of its cultured polish. "That I would just accept your disappearance, your dismissal of everything we shared?" "You should have," she managed, struggling for composure. "It was the sensible thing. To hell with sensible." He stepped forward, bringing with him the scent of rain and that familiar bergamot cologne that triggered a cascade of memories. "Do you know what these months have been like? Pretending to care about foundation meetings when all I could think about was whether you were all right, if what we had was real, or if I'd somehow imagined the depth of it." "It was real," she admitted. "The confession dragged from somewhere deep and vulnerable. But that doesn't make it right." "Then tell me to my face," he challenged, his voice dropping lower. "Look me in the eyes and tell me you don't love me, that you don't want this, us, that you'd rather be alone than fight whatever obstacles come our way." Sienna tried to summon the necessary words, but they wouldn't come. Not with him standing so close, his presence filling all the empty spaces she'd been living with for 17 weeks and 3 days. "I saw the photos," she said instead. "You and Catherine?" "A charade," he cut her off, his jaw tightening. "One last attempt to please my father before I told him the truth." "What truth?" His expression softened, intensity giving way to vulnerability she'd seen only in their most private moments. "That I love you. That no legacy, no fortune, no family, name is worth living without you." The wall Sienna had built crumbled. Tears she'd refused to shed for months finally spilled over. "Your family can accept my choice or not. It's theirs to make." He cupped her face in his hands, his touch achingly familiar after so long without it. "But I've made mine. I choose you, Sienna. I will always choose you." The kiss that followed was like finding water after months in the desert, desperate and healing and overwhelming all at once. His lips claimed hers with certainty that hadn't diminished during their separation, with hunger tempered by something deeper. Sienna felt herself responding instantly, all the reasons for staying apart dissolving under the undeniable truth of their connection. They stumbled through her apartment, relearning each other, making up for lost months with urgent touches and breathless confessions. His hands remembered every curve of her body, every spot that made her gasp and arch against him. Her fingers traced the new hollows beneath his ribs, physical evidence of his suffering during their separation. "I missed you," she whispered against his skin, the words inadequate for the ocean of feeling behind them. "Every day, every moment." "Then why?" he asked, drawing back to look into her eyes. "Why did you leave like that?" "Because I thought I was setting you free," she confessed, touching his face, tracing the cheekbone that had grown more pronounced. "From having to choose between your heritage and me." "You are my heritage," he said with unexpected fierceness. "The future I want to build. The rest is just circumstance, details that don't define who I am." He kissed her again, deeper, with possession that thrilled rather than threatened. "What's between us? That's the only reality worth protecting." Later, wrapped in tangled sheets and each other's arms, Sienna finally asked the question that had haunted her sleepless nights. "What happens now?" Alexander traced patterns on her shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "Now we stop running. From each other, from the truth of what we want." "And what is that truth, Alex?" His smile carried certainty that had been absent that terrible day in England. "That some things are worth fighting for. That connection like ours is too rare to sacrifice for tradition or expectation." He pressed his lips to her forehead. "That I want to build a life with you, Sienna Hart, whatever shape that takes, whatever challenges it brings. Even if it means walking away from the Wolf legacy, the foundation." She needed certainty that he understood what might be sacrificed. "The foundation does important work," he acknowledged, "but it will continue with or without me, following the exact path my father envisions." His fingers tangled gently in her hair. "And I'm not walking away from anything essential. I'm walking toward something irreplaceable." For the first time since leaving Blackwood Manor, Sienna allowed herself to hope. Not for a fairy tale where conflicts magically disappeared, but for the chance to face whatever came next together. No more running, no more hiding, no more sacrificing love for fear of the battle ahead. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, feeling possibility unfurl within her like music too long unplayed. "We write our own rules," he said simply. "Create our own path where music and tradition, passion and responsibility exist in harmony." His voice carried the confidence of a man who had made his choice and found peace in it. "But first, I think we have some lost time to make up for." As his mouth found hers again, Sienna felt creativity flooding back, the emotional fire that had been banked during their separation now roaring back to life. Tomorrow they would face practical realities, begin weaving their separate lives into one shared future. But tonight was for healing, for rediscovering, for celebrating the simple truth that had brought him across an ocean to her door. Some connections cannot be severed by distance or doubt. Some souls find each other across any divide. Some loves refuse to be denied, no matter how logical the reasons for surrender might seem. Chapter 8. Confrontations. The Metropolitan Museum Gala represented everything Alexander and Sienna had been, avoiding for the 3 weeks since their reunion, the public intersection of their worlds. After their emotional reconciliation in her Brooklyn apartment, they had created a protective bubble around themselves, venturing out only for necessities, spending days and nights relearning each other and discussing their future in the sanctuary of her small home. But tonight, that bubble would burst. The annual Arts Patrons Gala was too significant for Alexander to miss. The Wolf Foundation was a primary sponsor, and Sienna had been invited to perform. Stepping back into society together was inevitable, but neither had anticipated the added complication that arrived that morning. A message from Alexander's assistant confirming that Lord and Lady Wolf would be attending. "We don't have to do this," Alexander said, as their car approached the museum's illuminated facade. "We can turn around, go back to Brooklyn." Sienna smoothed the midnight blue gown she'd chosen for the evening, elegant but distinctly her own style, not an attempt to blend into high society. "And then what? Keep hiding? That's not who either of us is." She took his hand. "We face this together." The grand steps of the Met were lined with photographers, the flashbulbs creating a gauntlet of light as they ascended. Alexander's arm tightened, protectively around her waist, but Sienna kept her head high, her expression composed. Let them take their photos. Let them speculate. The narrative belonged to her and Alexander, not to gossip columns or society whispers. Inside, the Great Hall had been transformed into a glittering wonderland, the Met's classical architecture providing a backdrop for New York's elite in their finery. Conversations paused as they entered, gazes following their progress across the marble. Floor. Alexander navigated the space with practiced ease, shielding Sienna from the most overt curiosity, introducing her to those who approached with genuine interest rather than malicious speculation. "Alexander!" The voice came from behind them as they stood examining a display of Renaissance instruments. "I didn't expect to see you here." They turned to find Lady Wolfe, resplendent in emerald silk and family diamonds. Her expression was unreadable, as her gaze moved from her son to Sienna. "Mother," Alexander acknowledged, his tone carefully neutral, "you look well." "As do you." Something flickered in Lady Wolfe's eyes, perhaps surprise at the change in her son. The weight he'd lost during their separation had been regained, and there was a relaxed confidence in his bearing that contrasted with his former rigid control. "Miss Hart, I understand you'll be performing tonight." "Yes," Sienna replied, meeting the older woman's gaze directly. "A new composition. How innovative." Lady Wolfe's tone gave nothing away. "Alexander, your father is speaking with the museum director about the Foundation's upcoming exhibition sponsorship. I believe he expected your input." The message was clear. Alexander was needed in his official capacity, away from Sienna. Before he could respond, Sienna squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Go," she said quietly. "I need to check in with the other musicians anyway." Alexander hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her alone. "I'll find you before your performance." As he departed with his mother, Sienna released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The first hurdle cleared, not comfortably, but without disaster. She made her way toward the performance area, trying to focus on the music rather than the eyes following her movement through the crowd. She had nearly reached the East Gallery where the musicians were gathering when Lady Wolfe intercepted her. At the champagne bar, having apparently separated from Alexander. "Miss Hart," Lady Wolfe said, her cut-glass accent slicing through the ambient noise, "I believe it's time we had a proper conversation." Something in her tone made Sienna stop. This wasn't the dismissive aristocrat from Blackwood Manor. There was an intensity, a purpose in her manner that demanded attention. "I agree, Lady Wolfe." They found a relatively quiet alcove near the Greek sculptures. Lady Wolfe wasted no time on pleasantries. "My son believes himself in love with you." "The feeling is mutual," Sienna replied evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "Perhaps. But love doesn't conquer practicalities, Miss Hart." Lady Wolfe spoke without overt hostility, her tone almost clinical. "Alexander has responsibilities that extend beyond his personal desires. The foundation, the family holdings, generations of carefully cultivated connections and influence, these aren't trifles to be discarded for a passionate affair." The dismissive characterization stung, but Sienna maintained her composure. "If you've come to offer me money to disappear, you're wasting your time." Lady Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm not so crude. But I am practical. What can you offer my son that equals what he would sacrifice for you? Do you understand the world he comes from? The expectations he's been raised to fulfill. The question hit a nerve, the same doubt that had led Sienna to leave months earlier. But this time, her answer came from certainty rather than fear. "I offer him truth," she said quietly. "The freedom to be himself, not just the heir to a legacy. The chance to live with passion, not just duty. To be loved for who he is, not what he represents." Before Lady Wolf could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "She offers me truth, Mother, and the courage to live it." Alexander stood behind them, his expression resolute. He moved to Sienna's side, taking her hand openly, his thumb brushing reassuringly across her knuckles. Lady Wolf's face tightened. "You're making a spectacle, Alexander." "No, I'm making a choice." His voice was quiet, but carried absolute conviction. "I've spent my life fulfilling expectations, being the perfect heir, the perfect trustee, the perfect son, but with Sienna I'm simply myself, and that self is happier, more authentic, more alive than I've ever been. Your father will never accept this." Lady Wolf's voice held a warning, but also something else, concern, perhaps even a hint of protectiveness toward her son. Alexander's grip on Sienna's hand tightened. "Then that will be his choice to make, as this is mine." Lady Wolf studied them both, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. The resemblance between mother and son was suddenly striking. The same intensity, the same capacity for deep feeling beneath a controlled exterior. "You truly love her." It wasn't a question, but Alexander answered anyway. "With everything I am." A long moment passed. Then, surprisingly, Lady Wolf's rigid posture softened slightly. "I'm married for duty, not love. It was what women of my generation did." Her gaze shifted to Sienna, assessing her anew. "Perhaps the world has changed. Perhaps it should." She stepped closer to Sienna, her voice lowering. "If you love my son, truly love him, you'll need to be stronger than I ever was. This world will test you both." With that cryptic statement, she walked away, leaving Sienna and Alexander staring after her in stunned silence. "Did your mother just give us her blessing?" Sienna asked incredulously. "Not quite," Alexander replied, still watching his mother rejoin the gala. "But it's more than I expected. She recognized something in you, the same strength I've always seen." He turned to her fully, his eyes serious. "She's right about one thing. This world will test us. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Sienna touched his face, her eyes never leaving his. "I already tried the alternative. Living without you was not living at all." The confrontation with Lady Wolf proved to be just the first of many in the months that followed. Lord Wolf remained implacable in his disapproval, refusing to meet with Sienna again and speaking to Alexander only on foundation business. Board members questioned Alexander's commitment to the Wolf legacy. Society pages speculated about the unsuitable romance threatening the dynasty's future. Through it all, Alexander and Sienna stood firm. When financial pressures mounted, veiled threats about Alexander's position, subtle attempts to undermine Sienna's career, they faced them. Together, Alexander restructured his investments, creating independence from family holdings. Sienna leveraged her growing reputation to secure contracts that couldn't be easily sabotaged. They found unexpected allies as well. Lady Wolf, while never overtly supporting their relationship, began quietly countering the worst of Lord Wolf's opposition. Certain board members, the younger generation, recognized Alexander's vision for modernizing the foundation might actually strengthen its relevance. Critics, who had initially dismissed Sienna as Alexander's passing fancy, began acknowledging the artistic renaissance evident in her new compositions. Works that combined her natural fire with a newfound depth that even the most traditional reviewers couldn't ignore. Most surprising was the public's response. Where society insiders saw scandal, ordinary people saw a love story. The wealthy heir who chose passion over privilege, the talented musician who refused to compromise her art or her heart. Attendance at Sienna's concerts soared. Donations to foundation projects Alexander championed increased, particularly from younger patrons. The turning point came unexpectedly at the opening of a new music education center funded by the Wolf Foundation. After months of delicate negotiation, Alexander had secured approval for a project close to his heart, a center in a struggling Philadelphia neighborhood, much like the one where Sienna had grown up, designed to make classical music training accessible to talented children regardless of financial means. Sienna had composed a piece specifically for the event, a bridge between classical traditions and contemporary influences that spoke to the Foundation's evolving mission. As she took the stage, she saw Lord Wolf in the front row, his expression guarded but present, the first time he had attended any event where she performed since their confrontation at Blackwood Manor. The composition began with traditional, classical structures, elegant and disciplined, before gradually introducing elements that reflected the neighborhood's cultural heritage. Jazz influences, hints of gospel, rhythms that spoke of the community's diverse roots. Rather than clashing, the seemingly disparate elements enhanced each other, creating something both respectful of tradition and vibrantly new. As she played the final notes, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Even Lord Wolf, seated rigidly in the front row, couldn't deny the power of what she'd created, music that honored the past while embracing the future, much like the Foundation itself aspired to do. Afterward, he approached them at the reception, his expression guarded but no longer openly hostile. Alexander straightened imperceptibly, his hand finding Sienna's in silent solidarity. The composition was extraordinary, Lord Wolf admitted reluctantly. It seems I may have underestimated your understanding of what the Wolf legacy truly represents. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. A crack in the wall that had seemed impenetrable. That night, as they celebrated this small victory in the privacy of Alexander's Manhattan apartment, he took Sienna's hands and knelt before her. The gesture was unexpected. They had discussed marriage in abstract terms as a future possibility, but had agreed not to rush. "I don't want to wait any longer," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "These past months have shown me what matters, not titles or traditions, but the truth we've built together." He produced a ring unlike any Sienna had ever seen, not a traditional diamond, but a sapphire that matched his eyes, set in a band engraved with musical notes. "Marry me, Sienna, not because it's expected or sensible, but because I cannot imagine a day without you by my side." Tears blurred her vision as she pulled him to his feet. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. 1,000 times yes. As they sealed their engagement with a kiss, Sienna felt something settle within her, a certainty that had been building through every confrontation, every obstacle overcome. They had faced opposition from every direction, had weathered separation, and doubt had stood firm when it would have been easier to surrender. What remained was stronger for having been tested. A love not based on fairy tale perfection, but on the messy, complicated reality of two strong individuals choosing each other day after day, despite every reason the world gave them not to. A love worth fighting for. A love built to last. Chapter 9. Symphony of Surrender. Spring blossomed across the Italian countryside, painting the rolling hills with wild poppies and sweet-scented jasmine as Sienna and Alexander's wedding preparations transformed the ancient Villa Luminosa. Their choice of venue had raised aristocratic eyebrows. The Wolf family had married in London cathedrals for centuries, but the sun-drenched Tuscan estate, with its crumbling frescoes and secret gardens, embodied everything their love represented. Beauty emerging from unlikely places, tradition reimagined rather than rejected. Alexander stood on the villa's terrace, watching the sunset bathe the vineyard-covered hills in gold. 6 months had passed since his proposal. 6 months of planning. Not just a wedding, but the merging of two vastly different worlds. The journey hadn't been smooth. Lord Wolf had initially refused to attend, relenting only after Lady Wolf's rare but forceful intervention. But standing here, feeling the warm Italian breeze against his face, Alexander knew every battle had been worth fighting. "There you are," Sienna's voice came from behind him. "I've been looking everywhere." He turned to find her silhouetted in the doorway, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple white sundress that caught the fading light. The sight of her still made his heart stumble, even after all this time. "Just taking a moment," he said, reaching for her hand as she joined him. "Thinking about how far we've come." Sienna leaned against him, fitting perfectly under his arm. "Having second thoughts?" she teased, though he caught the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "Only about the seating arrangements," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I still think putting my great-aunt Gertrude next to your college jazz professor is asking for trouble." She laughed, but the sound held an edge of tension that had been present throughout the wedding preparations. For all her strength, Sienna still sometimes doubted her place in his world, still feared the day might come when he would regret choosing her over the easier path of conformity. "I just want everyone to feel welcome," she said, looking out over the landscape. "Your world, my world. I want them to see what we see, that they're not as separate as they think." Alexander understood her anxiety. Their guest list was a collision of universes. European aristocracy alongside Philadelphia music teachers, foundation board members seated with experimental jazz musicians Sienna had met in Brooklyn dive bars. "On paper it shouldn't work, just like them." "They will," he promised, massaging the knots of tension at the base of her neck. "And if they don't—" He spun her chair to face him, dropping to one knee. "Then they're missing the most beautiful composition ever written." The sunset cast them in golden light as he kissed her, a gentle reminder of what truly mattered amid the chaos of wedding plans and family politics. The most surprising transformation had come from Lady Wolf. What began as reluctant acceptance had evolved into something resembling enthusiasm. She arrived at Villa Luminosa 2 weeks before the ceremony, bringing not only her impeccable social connections, but genuine support. "The Contessa's daughter wore blush rather than white last spring," she informed Sienna during a final fitting of her unconventional gown. An ivory creation that flowed like liquid moonlight, its bodice embroidered with tiny musical notes that caught the light as she moved. It caused quite the sensation, but now everyone's doing it. Her eyes, so like Alexander's, held unexpected warmth. "You're starting trends already." "I'm not sure the classical music world considers me a trendsetter," Sienna replied, with a wry smile, thinking of the critics who still occasionally questioned her unorthodox approach. "I wasn't referring to music," Lady Wolf said, adjusting the gown's train with surprising attention to detail. "Alexander has changed since meeting you. For the better." She straightened, meeting Sienna's surprised gaze. "The foundation is more vital, more relevant than it's been in decades. His vision is clearer, his purpose stronger." "That's all him," Sienna protested. "You inspired it," Lady Wolf countered. "You showed him it was possible to honor tradition without being imprisoned by it. That's a gift we never gave him." The admission clearly cost her something. Pride, perhaps, or the acknowledgement of her own compromises over the years. Even Lord Wolf's resistance had begun to crack. The breakthrough came when Alexander presented his vision for the foundation's future, not as a concession to gain approval for their marriage, but as a genuine evolution that honored its heritage while embracing new directions. The Wolf name has always stood for cultural preservation, Alexander had explained during a tense dinner at the villa, showing his father meticulously researched plans. But preservation doesn't mean keeping art locked behind glass. It means ensuring it remains alive, relevant, accessible. Lord Wolf had studied the documents with guarded interest, his finger tracing the projected outcomes of Alexander's proposed initiatives. "This is not what I expected," he'd finally said. "I learned that from Sienna," Alexander replied simply. "How to honor tradition without being imprisoned by it." The phrase, unconsciously echoing what Lady Wolf would later say to Sienna, had struck a chord. Lord Wolf's gaze had shifted to Sienna, reassessing. Not acceptance, not yet, but something like recognition. 7 days before the wedding, while armies of florists and caterers descended on the villa, Alexander spirited Sienna away to a secluded beach house perched on cliffs above the Mediterranean. The stone cottage, with its whitewashed walls and sea-glass wind chimes, offered a sanctuary from the beautiful chaos they'd created. "Consider this an early honeymoon," he said, as they watched the sunset paint the water in impossible shades of gold and rose. "Just us before we become a public statement." Sienna leaned back against his chest on the terrace lounger, his arms wrapped around her waist. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and wild rosemary, and somewhere below, waves crashed against ancient rocks in a rhythm as old as time itself. "Everything's happening so fast," she mused, watching a distant sailboat drift along the horizon. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it this far, that everyone didn't tear us apart." Alexander's lips brushed the sensitive spot behind her, sending delicious shivers down her spine. "They tried, they failed, because you're as stubborn as I am," she teased, turning slightly to see his face. "Because some forces can't be stopped," he corrected, his voice deepening. "Do you remember that night in Paris, when you played for me in that empty hotel bar?" Sienna smiled at the memory. "How could I forget? That was the night everything changed." Alexander shook his head, his expression suddenly serious. "No," he said softly, his fingers threading through hers. "Everything changed the moment I heard you play at Royal Albert Hall. I just didn't recognize it yet." He turned her fully in his arms, those ice-blue eyes holding hers with naked sincerity. "You awakened something in me that night. Something I'd buried so deeply I'd forgotten it existed. The capacity to feel, to want, to choose, to be more than the sum of expectations." The raw honesty in his voice moved her deeply. The polished aristocrat was gone, leaving only the man, her man. "I was so afraid," she confessed, words she'd never fully articulated before. "Not of loving you, but of what that love might cost you." And now, his thumb traced the curve of her lower lip. Sienna reached up to follow the strong line of his jaw with her fingertips. "Now I understand that the only thing that would truly cost us is denying what we feel. Everything else, the disapproval, the adjustments, the compromise, that's just life, real life." Something shifted in Alexander's expression, a deepening of emotion that made her breath catch. "I want a lifetime of real with you, Sienna Hart. The arguments and the making up, the struggles and the triumphs, the ordinary Tuesdays and the extraordinary concerts. All of it." He lifted her then, carrying her from the terrace into the bedroom where moonlight spilled across crisp white sheets. Their clothes fell away under reverent hands, each garment removed an unveiling of something sacred. Alexander laid her back against the pillows with such tenderness that tears pricked her eyes. "What is it?" he whispered, catching a tear with his thumb. "Sometimes I look at you and can't believe you're real," she admitted. "That this is real." His answer was to kiss her. Not with the restrained passion of their early encounters, but with the soul-deep knowledge of a man who had found his home. His lips traveled from her mouth to her throat, lingering at the pulse point that betrayed. Her racing heart, lower still, worshipping the curves of her breasts, the soft plane of her stomach, the sensitive inside of her thighs, until she was arching beneath him, his name a plea on her lips. When he finally moved above her, their bodies joining in the most ancient of dances, it transcended physical passion. This was communion, souls finding their perfect counterpoint. After lifetimes of searching, every stroke, every gasp, every whispered confession built towards something beyond pleasure, something holy. "I see you," Alexander breathed against her lips as they moved together. "All of you. The fire and the fear, the strength and the vulnerability, everything you are." "And you still want me?" she asked, the question rising from some deep place of insecurity that even his love hadn't fully healed. His rhythm faltered as he stared down at her, his gaze intense in the moonlight. "Want you, Sienna, I worship you." The words were raw, honest, stripped of artifice. "You are the miracle I never thought to ask for, the answer to questions I didn't know how to form." Their lovemaking became something transcendent then, a physical expression of spiritual connection. Each touch an affirmation, each kiss a vow more binding than any they would speak before witnesses. When they finally lay spent and satisfied, limbs entwined, the barriers between their worlds seemed not just insignificant, but non-existent. There was only this, two souls who had found in each other something essential and irreplaceable. "I never knew it could be like this," Alexander whispered against her hair, his voice revealing wonder and a hint of sadness for all the years he'd spent holding himself apart from such feelings. "Like what?" she asked, tracing patterns on his chest, feeling his heart gradually slow beneath her fingertips. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice held a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "Like coming home to a place I've never been." The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations, family arrivals, and small moments of panic, expertly managed by Lady Wolfe, who had unexpectedly become Sienna's strongest ally. When Sienna's mother arrived from Philadelphia, clearly intimidated by the villa's grandeur and the titled guests, it was Lady Wolfe who took her under wing, ensuring she felt not just included, but honored as the mother of the bride. She worked 3 jobs to pay for Sienna's first piano lessons, Lady Wolfe informed a duchess, whose name Sienna couldn't remember. The kind of dedication that builds true character. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect. Sienna stood before a mirror in the villa's bridal suite, her gown catching the golden Italian sunlight. Her mother, who had worked so hard to give her every opportunity, adjusted her veil with tears in her eyes. "I always knew you were destined for extraordinary things," she said, "but I never imagined this." "A wolf, you mean?" Sienna asked with a smile. Her mother shook her head. "No, a woman who refused to compromise who she is, even for love. Who found a man who loves her not despite her fire, but because of it." As Sienna walked down the aisle toward Alexander, every moment of doubt, every struggle, every tear she'd seemed worth it for this, the look of absolute wonder on his face as he watched her approach, as if she were a miracle he couldn't quite believe was real. Their vows silenced even the skeptics among the guests. These were not the words of a passing infatuation or a rebellion against convention, but of 2 souls who had found in each other something essential and irreplaceable. "You taught me that. Love isn't a surrender," Alexander said, his voice carrying across the hushed garden. "It's a liberation. With you, I'm not less of who I was meant to be. I'm more. Completely, authentically more." Sienna's response came straight from her heart. "Before you, I played music. With you, I am music. Every note truer, every melody deeper, every harmony more complete. I promise to love you not as the world says I should, but as my soul demands I must, completely, fiercely, eternally." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the string quartet began to play. Not a traditional wedding march, but the composition Sienna had written for Alexander, the piece that had first cracked Lord Wolf's resistance. A piece about tradition and innovation, past and future, finding harmony in seeming opposition, just like them. At the reception, as twilight settled over the Tuscan hills and lanterns cast their golden glow across the villa's gardens, Sienna found herself momentarily alone, watching Alexander speak with his father. The conversation appeared intense, but not confrontational, a breakthrough in itself. As she observed them, Lady Wolf appeared at her side. "He will come around completely eventually," she said, following Sienna's gaze. "My husband is stubborn, but not blind. He can see how happy Alexander is." "And you?" Sienna asked. "Have you come around?" Lady Wolf considered her with those penetrating blue eyes, so like her son's. "I have lived long enough to recognize that happiness is too rare to sacrifice on the altar of convention." She touched Sienna's arm lightly, a gesture of affection that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "You make him happy. That is enough." As Lady Wolf departed to manage some aspect of the reception, Alexander returned to Sienna's side, slipping an arm around her waist. "What did my mother want?" he asked, dropping a kiss on her bare shoulder. "I think she just gave us her blessing," Sienna replied, still slightly amazed. Alexander smiled, the relaxed, genuine smile that had become more frequent since they'd found each other. "And my father has just informed me that while he still has reservations about my precipitate choices, he acknowledges that you bring certain valuable perspectives to the family." Sienna laughed. "High praise indeed. From him? The equivalent of a sonnet." Alexander drew her onto the dance floor as the musicians began a waltz. "Mrs. Wolf," he murmured against her ear as they moved together in perfect harmony. "That sounds strange," she admitted, following his lead through the other dancing couples. "Good strange or bad strange?" She considered, feeling the weight of his family name alongside her own identity as an artist. Different strange. "But I think I like it." As they danced beneath the stars, surrounded by the unlikely blend of their separate worlds now merging into one shared future, Sienna felt a sense of rightness settle over her. They had challenged expectations, redefined boundaries, and in doing so, had created something new and beautiful. A harmony composed of apparent contradictions, a melody that honored tradition while embracing innovation. Their road hadn't been easy. There would be challenges ahead, navigating their careers, their families, the inevitable adjustments of marriage. But looking up at Alexander, seeing the love in his eyes, Sienna knew with absolute certainty that there was nowhere else she belonged. In finding each other, they had each found themselves, the truth beneath the expectations, the authentic core beneath carefully constructed facades. This wasn't a fairy tale ending with all conflicts magically resolved. This was something better, a real beginning with all its complexity and promise. A marriage of true souls, a love that had surrendered nothing except fear. Chapter 10. Eternal. Crescendo, Sienna stands backstage at Carnegie Hall, her heartbeat matching the hushed anticipation beyond the curtain. Tonight isn't merely a performance. It's her symphony's premiere, her soul rendered in notes and harmonies for the world to hear. "Breathe," Alexander whispers, appearing beside her like a talisman. 5 years of marriage hasn't dulled the electricity that surges when his fingers brush her bare shoulder. She turns to find him watching her with that crystalline gaze that still disarms her, equal parts desire, pride, and reverence. "What if they don't understand what I'm trying to say?" "They will," he promises, his touch grounding her. "And if they don't, it doesn't matter. You didn't create this for their approval." This truth, that art exists beyond judgment, is one of countless gifts he's given her, just as she's given him the courage to reshape the Wolf legacy into something vital rather than merely venerable. From the family box, their 3-year-old daughter Arya waves frantically, perched improbably on Lord Wolf's knee. The sight still startles Sienna, her fierce, aloof father-in-law now wrapped around the finger of a child who bridges bloodlines once considered irreconcilable. "Go transform them," Alexander murmurs against her ear, his lips brushing the sensitive spot that sends heat cascading through her body. "Then come home to me." The promise in his words carries her onto the stage with heightened awareness, every nerve ending alive. As she raises her baton, the hall falls silent. The symphony begins, her life distilled into melody, the journey from solitary pianist to beloved wife and mother, artist and disruptor. The composition builds like their love story. Initially tentative, then bolder, finally breaking conventions while honoring what came before. When the final triumphant notes soar to the rafters, the audience erupts before the echo fades. Through tears, Sienna finds Alexander's gaze across the distance, always finding him, regardless of separation. Hours later, after accolades and champagne, after putting Arya to bed with stories of princesses who saved themselves, they stand on their penthouse balcony beneath a velvet sky pricked with stars. "I have something for you," Alexander says, fastening a locket around her neck, Arya's portrait nestled against his own. His fingers linger on her skin, igniting familiar flames. "To remind you that wherever your music takes you, we're with you." "I don't need reminding," she whispers, turning in his arms. "You're written into every measure I compose." Their kiss begins with tenderness that rapidly combusts into urgency. 5 years together has taught them each other's bodies like virtuosos mastering rare instruments, knowing precisely where to touch, how much pressure brings ecstasy, which rhythms build toward perfect release. Alexander's mouth traces fire down her throat as his hands make swift work of her gown, leaving her naked in the spring night air. The risk of distant eyes witnessing their passion only heightens their desire. "Here," he breathes against her breast, "I want you under the open sky." He lifts her onto the wide balustrade, sheltered by strategic landscaping but exposed to the heavens. When he enters her, the familiar becoming somehow miraculous again, Sienna gasps his name like a prayer. They move together with precision, born of profound knowledge, yet with wonder that never diminishes. "Look at me," he commands softly, as pleasure builds between them. Their eyes lock, barriers completely dissolved, the aristocrat and the pianist, the heir and the scholarship student, now simply man and woman, soul meeting soul. "I love you beyond reason," Alexander whispers against her mouth as they crest together. "Beyond duty, beyond tradition, beyond time." "And I love you beyond music," she answers, her body shuddering around his. "Beyond any composition I could create." Later, wrapped in tangled sheets in each other's arms, Sienna traces the scar along his ribs, a reminder of the motorcycle accident shortly after Arya's birth when she'd nearly lost him. "Do you know what today is?" he asks, capturing her wandering hand, the anniversary of the night we met. "When I played at Royal Albert Hall, and you sat in the 3rd row looking thoroughly disapproving." His smile illuminates the darkness. "I wasn't disapproving. I was drowning." "In what?" "Possibility," he murmurs, pulling her beneath him again, his body already hardening against hers. The possibility that life could burn rather than merely exist. As Alexander moves inside her again, slower this time, with deliberate intensity that makes her arch against him in sweet torment, Sienna surrenders to the truth they've discovered together. Some loves aren't meant to be tamed or confined by Expectation. Some souls find each other across any divide. Some fires, once ignited, burn eternal.